What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
When it comes to Sister Wives, fans have always paid close attention to the drama. The arguments, the emotional moments, the major turning points in the Brown family story. But sometimes, the biggest revelations don't come from the loudest scenes. They come from the quiet details that go unnoticed. And recently, viewers have started to realize something about Kody Brown that completely changes how his actions are being interpreted. It's not a single moment. It's not one dramatic confession. It's a pattern, a subtle shift that has been building over time, right in front of everyone. And now that fans are seeing it, they can't unsee it. Because once you notice this detail, it changes everything. To understand it, we have to go back to how Kody was originally perceived. In the early seasons of Sister Wives, Kody was often presented as energetic, optimistic, a man trying to balance multiple relationships while keeping a large family connected. He talked about unity, about fairness, about making sure each wife felt valued and supported. That was the image. That was the expectation. But as the seasons went on, something began to shift. Not all at once, not in a way that immediately stood out, but gradually, in small moments that didn't seem significant at the time, until now. One of the first things fans are pointing out is the change in how Kody communicates. In earlier years, his conversations, while not perfect, often included an effort to listen, to explain, to find some kind of middle ground. But more recently, viewers have noticed a different tone, more direct, more defensive, sometimes even dismissive. And while tone alone might not seem like a big deal, it becomes important when you see it happening consistently. Because communication is the foundation of any relationship, and when that foundation changes, everything built on it starts to feel different. Then there's the issue of attention. In a plural family, balance is key, or at least it's supposed to be. Time, energy, emotional investment, all of these things need to be distributed in a way that feels fair. But fans have started noticing that Kody's attention doesn't seem as evenly spread as it once was. Certain relationships appear to receive more focus, more effort, more presence, while others feel more distant, more strained. And this isn't just speculation, it's something that becomes visible through repeated patterns. Who he spends time with, who he prioritizes, who he seems most emotionally connected to. These are details that on their own might not stand out, but when you look at them together, they tell a story that viewers are only now beginning to fully understand. Another key detail fans are pointing out is how Kody responds to conflict. Conflict has always been part of Sister Wives, that's not new. But the way it's handled has changed. In the past, there was often an attempt, however imperfect, to resolve issues collectively, to bring everyone into the conversation, to work towards some kind of shared solution. Now those moments feel different, more divided, more individual, less about finding common ground and more about standing firm in a position. And that shift matters, because it reflects a deeper changing mindset, a move away from we towards something more individual. For fans, this realization has sparked a wave of discussion, because it challenges the original idea of what the family was supposed to be, a unified structure, a shared life, a collective effort. And instead, what they're seeing now feels more fragmented, more separate, more complex. But perhaps the most important detail, the one that truly changes everything, is how consistent these patterns have become. It's not just one episode, not just one season. It's a trend, a direction, a gradual transformation that has been happening over time. And that's why so many viewers didn't notice it at first, because change that happens slowly is harder to see, until suddenly it's undeniable. For Kody Brown, this raises important questions, not just about his role in the family, but about how that role has evolved, whether intentionally or not. Because leadership in a family like this requires balance, awareness, a willingness to adapt. And when those elements shift, the impact is felt by everyone. At the same time, it's important to recognize that no situation is one-sided. There are multiple perspectives, multiple experiences, and every relationship within the family has its own dynamics. But what fans are reacting to isn't just individual moments, it's the overall pattern, the accumulation of small details that together create a much bigger picture. And now that picture is becoming clearer. As we move into the next part, we'll break down specific moments that fans believe highlight this shift, scenes that may have seemed ordinary at the time, but now reveal something much more significant. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden, it's just waiting for the right moment to be seen. Once fans began noticing the pattern in Kody Brown's behavior on Sister Wives, something unexpected happened. Old scenes started to feel different. Moments that once seemed normal, or at least not that significant, suddenly carried a new meaning. Because when you recognize a pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. And that's exactly what viewers have been doing. they've been going back, rewatching episodes, looking at interactions through a new lens. And in doing so, they're picking up on details that didn't stand out before. One of the most talked about shifts is in how Kody handles emotional conversations. There are scenes where one of the wives opens up, expressing frustration, sadness, or concern. In earlier seasons, even when things were tense, there was often an attempt to engage, to listen, to validate. But in more recent moments, fans have noticed a change. Instead of leaning into those conversations, Kody sometimes appears to pull away, to shut down, or to redirect the conversation towards his own perspective. And while that might seem subtle, it has a big impact. Because when someone shares something emotional, the response they receive shapes the entire interaction. And when that response feels dismissive, or even just disconnected, it creates distance. Another set of moments that fans are re-examining involve decision-making. In a family structure like this, decisions are supposed to be collaborative. That's part of what made the dynamic work in the first place, at least in theory. But viewers are now pointing out scenes where decisions feel more one-sided, where discussions turn into declarations, where input from others doesn't seem to carry the same weight. And again, this isn't always obvious in the moment. Sometimes it's the tone, the timing, the way a conversation ends. But when you look at multiple instances together, the pattern becomes clearer. Then there's the interactions that involve tension, especially with Kody Brown and Kody Brown. Fans have pointed out that in certain scenes, the emotional gap between Kody and these relationships feels more pronounced than it used to. Not just disagreement, but disconnection. Moments where they seem to be speaking past each other rather than to each other. And what makes these moments stand out now is how consistent they feel with the larger pattern. It's not just about conflict, it's about how that conflict is handled. Or in some cases, not handled at all. There are also quieter scenes that fans are now paying attention to. Moments without arguments, without big emotional confrontations. Just everyday interactions. Because sometimes those moments reveal the most. Body language, eye contact, tone of voice. Small details that don't draw attention to themselves, but still communicate something important. And in many of these scenes, viewers are noticing a shift in energy, a sense of distance, a lack of warmth that contrasts with earlier seasons. It's not always dramatic, but it's noticeable, especially when compared side by side with older footage. For Robyn Brown, the dynamic appears different. Fans often point out that interactions involving her tend to feel more aligned, more connected. And whether or not that perception is entirely accurate, it has become a major part of the conversation, because it feeds into the larger narrative that viewers are starting to piece together. A narrative about where Kody's focus is, where his emotional investment lies, and how that affects the rest of the family. What's interesting is that none of these moments on their own are necessarily shocking. There's no single scene that explains everything, no one moment that reveals the entire truth. Instead, it's the accumulation, the repetition, the consistency of certain behaviors over time. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because patterns are harder to dismiss than isolated incidents. They suggest intention, or at the very least, direction. For fans of Sister Wives, this has completely changed the viewing experience. It's no longer just about watching what happens next. It's about understanding what's already happened, connecting the dots, reinterpreting the story with new awareness. And that's why this realization feels so significant, because it turns familiar moments into something new, something deeper, something more revealing. As we move into the next part, we'll take a closer look at how these patterns may have influenced the biggest turning points in the family, especially the decisions that led to major changes in relationships. Because when you understand the pattern, the outcomes start to make a lot more sense.
Once fans began recognizing the pattern in Kody Brown's behavior on Sister Wives, something even bigger started to make sense. The major breaking points in the family didn't come out of nowhere. They were built over time. Because patterns don't just exist in isolation, they lead somewhere. And in this case, they led to some of the most significant turning points in the Brown family's history. One of the clearest examples is the shift in Kody's relationship with Kody Brown. For a long time, their dynamic had its challenges, but there was still a sense of effort, a sense that things could be worked on, improved. But as the pattern in Kody's behavior became more noticeable, especially in how he communicated and responded to emotional needs, that sense of possibility began to fade. Fans now look back at certain conversations between them and see something different. Moments where Kody was expressing what she needed, what she was missing, and instead of those needs being fully acknowledged, they were often met with resistance, defensiveness, or a shift in focus. At the time, these moments may have seemed like typical relationship struggles, but now they feel like early warning signs that the emotional gap between them was growing, and eventually that gap became too big to ignore. Kody's decision to leave wasn't just about one issue, it was the result of a pattern that had been building for years, a pattern that made her feel unheard, unfulfilled, disconnected. And when fans look back at those earlier moments now, they can see how everything was leading to that outcome. A similar pattern can be seen in Kody's relationship with Kody Brown. While their dynamic has always been different, more practical, more grounded, The same shifts in communication and connection started to appear over time. There were moments where Janelle seemed to be trying to find common ground, to navigate disagreements in a calm and logical way. But when those efforts weren't fully met, it created tension. Not explosive tension, but a steady, underlying strain. And that kind of strain can be just as impactful because it builds quietly until it reaches a point where something has to change. For fans, seeing these patterns play out across multiple relationships is what makes this realization so powerful. It's not about one person or one situation. It's about consistency, the same behaviors, the same responses, showing up in different contexts and leading to similar outcomes. Even in Kody's relationship with Meri Brown, the pattern becomes visible. While their dynamic has its own unique history, the sense of emotional distance has been a recurring theme. Conversations that feel unresolved, moments where connection seems just out of reach, and over time, that distance becomes part of the relationship itself, something that's no longer surprising, but still significant. Then there's Robyn Brown, where the dynamic appears more stable, more aligned, and this contrast is something fans have been discussing heavily. Because when one relationship feels different from the others, it naturally raises questions about priorities, about focus, about where energy is being directed. And while every relationship is unique, the difference in how these dynamics play out has become a key part of the larger conversation. What's important to understand is that none of these breaking points happened overnight. They were the result of accumulated moments, small interactions, subtle shifts, repeated patterns that gradually shaped the direction of each relationship. And that's why they're so easy to miss in real time, because when you're in the middle of something, it's hard to see the bigger picture. It's only when you step back, when you look at everything together, that the full story becomes clear. For viewers of Sister Wives, this has completely changed how they interpret the family's journey. What once seemed like sudden decisions now feel like inevitable outcomes. What once felt confusing now feels understandable, because the pattern provides context, it connects the dots, it explains how the family moved from unity to separation. And that's what makes this realization so impactful. It doesn't just change how fans see Kody, it changes how they see the entire story. As we move into the next part, we'll dive even deeper into the emotional side of this pattern, exploring how it affected each wife on a personal level, and why those effects were so significant. Because behind every pattern, there are real emotions driving the outcome. As the pattern in Kody Brown's behavior became more visible on Sister Wives, it wasn't just changing the structure of the family, it was deeply affecting each relationship on an emotional level. Because patterns don't just shape outcomes, they shape how people feel, how they experience connection, how they define their place within a relationship. And for each of the wives, that experience looked different. But there was one common thread: something had shifted. For Christine Brown, the emotional impact was perhaps the most visible. Over time, viewers saw her move from hope to frustration to clarity. There were moments where she openly expressed what she needed: more presence, more affection, more emotional connection. And when those needs weren't met consistently, it created a sense of imbalance, not just in the relationship, but in how she saw her future. Because when someone feels like they're giving more than they're receiving, it eventually leads to a decision: stay and continue trying, or leave and choose something different. For Christine, that decision became clear, but it didn't happen overnight. It was the result of repeated moments where the emotional gap became harder to ignore. For Janelle Brown, the experience was more subtle, but no less significant. Janelle has often been seen as practical, independent, less driven by emotional expression, and more focused on stability. But that doesn't mean the emotional impact wasn't there. It just showed up differently. Instead of open frustration, there was a gradual shift, a sense of detachment, a focus on her own path rather than trying to force alignment where it no longer existed. And that kind of response can be just as telling, because it reflects a quiet acceptance that something has changed, that the relationship is no longer what it once was. With Meri Brown, the emotional impact carried a different kind of weight. Her journey with Kody had already been marked by distance, by unresolved tension, by a connection that felt uncertain. So when the broader pattern became more visible, it didn't create something entirely new, it reinforced what was already there. A sense of separation, a feeling of being on the outside of something that once felt central. And over time, that feeling can become part of how you define the relationship itself, something you learn to navigate, but never fully resolve. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose experience appears different from the others. Fans often point out that her relationship with Kody seems more stable, more connected, and because of that, the emotional impact of the pattern doesn't appear in the same way. But that contrast is exactly what has fueled so much discussion. Because when one relationship feels strong while others are struggling, it naturally raises questions about balance, about fairness, about where energy is being directed. And while every relationship is unique, the difference in how these dynamics play out has become a key part of the larger conversation.
What's important to understand is that none of these breaking points happened overnight. They were the result of accumulated moments, small interactions, subtle shifts, repeated patterns that gradually shaped the direction of each relationship. And that's why they're so easy to miss in real time, because when you're in the middle of something, it's hard to see the bigger picture. It's only when you step back, when you look at everything together, that the full story becomes clear. For viewers of Sister Wives, this has completely changed how they interpret the family's journey. What once seemed like sudden decisions now feel like inevitable outcomes. What once felt confusing now feels understandable. Because the pattern provides context, it connects the dots. It explains how the family moved from unity to separation. And that's what makes this realization so impactful. It doesn't just change how fans see Kody, it changes how they see the entire story. As we move into the next part, we'll dive even deeper into the emotional side of this pattern, exploring how it affected each wife on a personal level and why those effects were so significant. Because behind every pattern, there are real emotions driving the outcome. As the pattern in Kody Brown's behavior became more visible on Sister Wives, it wasn't just changing the structure of the family, it was deeply affecting each relationship on an emotional level. Because patterns don't just shape outcomes, they shape how people feel, how they experience connection, how they define their place within a relationship. And for each of the wives, that experience looked different. But there was one common thread: something had shifted. For Kody Brown, the emotional impact was perhaps the most visible. Over time, viewers saw her move from hope to frustration to clarity. There were moments where she openly expressed what she needed: more presence, more affection, more emotional connection. And when those needs weren't met consistently, it created a sense of imbalance, not just in the relationship, but in how she saw her future. Because when someone feels like they're giving more than they're receiving, it eventually leads to a decision: stay and continue trying, or leave and choose something different. For Kody, that decision became clear. But it didn't happen overnight. It was the result of repeated moments where the emotional gap became harder to ignore. For Janelle Brown, the experience was more subtle, but no less significant. Janelle has often been seen as practical, independent, less driven by emotional expression and more focused on stability. But that doesn't mean the emotional impact wasn't there. It just showed up differently. Instead of open frustration, there was a gradual shift, a sense of detachment, a focus on her own path rather than trying to force alignment where it no longer existed. And that kind of response can be just as telling, because it reflects a quiet acceptance that something has changed, that the relationship is no longer what it once was. With Meri Brown, the emotional impact carried a different kind of weight. Her journey with Kody had already been marked by distance, by unresolved tension, by a connection that felt uncertain. So when the broader pattern became more visible, it didn't create something entirely new, it reinforced what was already there. A sense of separation, a feeling of being on the outside of something that once felt central. And over time, that feeling can become part in how you define the relationship itself, something you learn to navigate but never fully resolve. Then there's Robyn Brown, whose experience appears different from the others. Fans often point out that her relationship with Kody seems more stable, more connected, and because of that, the emotional impact of the pattern doesn't appear in the same way. But that contrast is exactly what has fueled so much discussion. Because when one relationship feels strong while others are struggling, it naturally raises questions about balance, about fairness, about where energy is being directed. And while every relationship is unique, the difference in how these dynamics play out has become a key part of the larger conversation. What's important to understand is that none of these breaking points happened overnight. They were the result of accumulated moments, small interactions, subtle shifts, repeated patterns that gradually shaped the direction of each relationship. And that's why they're so easy to miss in real time. Because when you're in the middle of something, it's hard to see the bigger picture. It's only when you step back, when you look at everything together, that the full story becomes clear. For viewers of Sister Wives, this has completely changed how they interpret the family's journey. What once seemed like sudden decisions now feel like inevitable outcomes. What once felt confusing now feels understandable. Because the pattern provides context, it connects the dots, it explains how the family moved from unity to separation. And that's what makes this realization so impactful. It doesn't just change how fans see Kody.
As the pattern in Kody Brown's behavior became clearer, something else started to grow just as quickly: fan reaction. Because viewers of Sister Wives weren't just watching anymore. They were analyzing, questioning, connecting the dots in a way they hadn't before. And that shift in audience perspective is a big part of why this topic has suddenly become so intense. The truth is, fans didn't ignore these details before because they didn't care. They missed them because the story was unfolding in real time, episode by episode, moment by moment, without the full picture. But now, with years of content and hindsight, everything looks different. Because hindsight brings clarity, and clarity changes perception. One of the biggest reasons fans are reacting so strongly now is because the pattern feels undeniable. It's not based on one opinion or one isolated scene. It's based on repetition, consistency, a series of moments that all point in the same direction. And when viewers start to see that, it creates a sense of realization, almost like discovering something that was hidden in plain sight. That realization can be powerful because it makes people feel like they've uncovered the truth themselves. And when that happens, reactions tend to be stronger, more emotional, more invested. Another factor is the emotional connection fans have built over time. For years, viewers have followed the journeys of Meri Brown, Janelle Brown, Christine Brown, and Robyn Brown. They've watched their struggles, their growth, their relationships evolve. And when you invest that much time into a story, you naturally develop opinions, you form attachments, you start to care about outcomes. So when fans begin to feel like certain patterns have led to unfair or unbalanced situations, those feelings become personal, not because they're directly involved, but because they've been emotionally connected to the story for so long. And that emotional investment amplifies everything. It turns observations into strong opinions. It turns discussions into debates. It turns moments into major talking points. There's also the role of social media. Today, fans don't just watch shows, they talk about them. They share clips, they analyze scenes, they break down interactions in detail. And once a pattern is noticed, it spreads quickly. One person points something out, others start to see it too, and suddenly it becomes part of the larger narrative, a shared realization. And once that happens, it's hard to reverse, because now every new episode is viewed through that same lens. Every new interaction is compared to what's already been noticed, and that reinforces the pattern even more. For Kody Brown, this shift in perception has had a significant impact, because public opinion isn't just shaped by what happens, it's shaped by how people interpret what happens. And right now, that interpretation is more critical, more analytical, more focused on patterns rather than individual moments. But it's important to understand that this reaction isn't just about criticism. It's also about understanding. Fans are trying to make sense of what they've seen over the years, to piece together the story in a way that feels complete. And that process naturally involves questioning, reevaluating, looking at things from a different perspective. For viewers of Sister Wives, this has transformed the experience. It's no longer just about watching a reality show. It's about interpreting a long-term narrative, understanding character development, recognizing patterns that weren't obvious before. And that makes the story feel deeper, more complex, more real. Because in real life, patterns matter. They shape relationships, they influence decisions, they determine outcomes. And that's exactly what fans are seeing now. Not just isolated events, but a continuous thread that connects everything together. As we move into the next part, we'll explore whether this pattern was intentional or something that developed over time, and what that means for how fans interpret Kody's role in the family moving forward. Because understanding why something happens can change how you see it completely. As fans continue breaking down the behavior of Kody Brown on Sister Wives, one major question keeps coming up. Was this pattern intentional, or did it develop over time without him even realizing it? Because the answer to that question changes everything. It affects how viewers interpret his actions. It shapes whether people see him as deliberately making certain choices or simply reacting to changing circumstances. And the truth is, it's not a simple yes or no. Some fans believe the pattern feels too consistent to be accidental. They point to the way certain relationships seem to receive more time, more emotional investment, and more attention. They highlight repeated moments where communication breaks down in similar ways. And for them, that consistency suggests intention, a conscious, or at least semi-conscious, direction in how Kody approaches his relationships. But others see it differently. They believe the pattern may have developed gradually, that it wasn't planned, but rather shaped by circumstances, stress, family changes, emotional fatigue. Because maintaining multiple relationships over time is complex. It requires constant balance, constant awareness, and as situations evolve, it's possible for that balance to shift without a clear decision being made. In this perspective, the pattern isn't about intention, it's about adaptation, or even drift, a gradual movement in one direction that becomes noticeable only after time has passed. What makes this question so compelling is that both interpretations can exist at the same time, because human behavior isn't always fully intentional or fully accidental. Sometimes it's a mix of both, a series of choices influenced by emotion, environment, and experience. For Kody Brown, the evolution of the family likely played a major role. In the early days, the focus was on building something new, creating a unified structure, establishing relationships. But as time went on, the challenges changed. Children grew up, responsibilities shifted, relationships faced new pressures. And with those changes came new dynamics, new priorities, new emotional realities. It's also important to consider how stress can influence behavior. Over time, stress can impact communication, decision-making, emotional availability. And when that happens, patterns can emerge, not because they're planned, but because they're repeated responses to ongoing situations. For example, if certain conversations consistently lead to tension, it's natural for someone to begin avoiding or shortening those interactions, not out of intention to create distance, but as a way to manage discomfort. But over time, that avoidance becomes a pattern, and that pattern creates distance anyway. This is how something unintentional can still have very real consequences. Another layer to this discussion involves perception, because what fans see is based on edited footage, selected moments, a narrative shaped for television. That doesn't mean the patterns aren't real, but it does mean they're being interpreted through a specific lens, and that lens can influence how intentional those patterns appear. For viewers of Sister Wives, this adds complexity to the conversation, because it reminds us that there are multiple sides to every story, multiple perspectives that may not always be visible. But at the same time, perception still matters, because perception is what shapes audience understanding. It's what drives discussion. It's what turns patterns into narratives. And right now, the narrative around Kody Brown is being shaped by this question of intention, whether fans see him as someone making deliberate choices or someone navigating a situation that gradually shifted beyond his control. What's clear is that regardless of intent, the impact of the pattern is real. It has affected relationships, changed dynamics, led to major decisions within the family, and that's what ultimately matters most. Because in relationships, outcomes are shaped not just by intention, but by action, and repeated actions create patterns. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these patterns have influenced the biggest decisions made by the wives, and why those decisions now feel more understandable than ever. Because when you understand the why, the what happened next starts to make perfect sense.
Once the pattern in Kody Brown's behavior became clearer, the biggest question for fans of Sister Wives was no longer, what is happening? It became, why did they make those decisions? Because the truth is, the most dramatic moments in the Brown family, the separations, the emotional distance, the major life changes, didn't happen suddenly. They were the result of everything that came before. And now, with a clearer understanding of the pattern, those decisions feel less shocking and more inevitable. Let's start with Christine Brown. Her decision to leave was one of the most defining moments in the entire series. At the time, it felt bold, unexpected to some, even dramatic. But looking back now, fans are starting to see it differently. They're seeing the build-up, the repeated moments where her emotional needs weren't fully met, the conversations where she expressed what she was missing, connection, affection, partnership, and didn't feel those needs were truly addressed. And when those moments happen once, they can be worked through. But when they happen again and again, they create a pattern that eventually leads to clarity. For Christine, that clarity came in the form of a decision, to choose a life where she felt valued and fulfilled. And when fans look at it through that lens, it doesn't feel sudden anymore. It feels like the natural outcome of everything that came before. With Janelle Brown, the shift was quieter, but just as significant. Janelle has always approached life with a sense of independence, practicality, a focus on stability over emotion. But even within that framework, the pattern still had an impact. Over time, viewers noticed her becoming more self-focused, more independent, less reliant on the family structure for her sense of direction. And while she didn't make a dramatic exit in the same way, her decisions reflected a similar realization, that her path didn't have to be defined by the existing dynamic, that she could create her own version of stability, on her own terms. Then there's Meri Brown. Her journey looks different from the others, less about a single defining decision and more about a gradual shift, a slow movement away from dependence on the relationship, toward independence, self-discovery. And while her situation with Kody Brown has remained complex, the pattern still played a role, because it influenced how she saw the relationship, how she defined her place within it, and ultimately, how she chose to move forward.
Her decision wasn't about one moment. It was about evolution, a steady process of redefining herself beyond the limitations of the past. And then we have Robyn Brown. Her position within the family appears more stable, more aligned with Kody. And because of that, her decisions reflect a different experience, one where the pattern didn't create the same level of conflict or distance. But that contrast is exactly what has fueled so much discussion among fans. Because when one relationship remains strong while others change, it highlights the differences even more. It raises questions about balance, about attention, about emotional investment. And those questions become part of how viewers interpret the entire story. What's important to understand is that each of these decisions, whether it was leaving, stepping back, or redefining independence, was shaped by the same underlying pattern, the same shifts in communication, the same changes in emotional connection, the same gradual movement away from the original structure of the family. And that's why they feel connected, because they are. They're different responses to the same evolving reality. For viewers of Sister Wives, this realization brings a new level of clarity. It turns what once felt like separate events into a cohesive narrative, a story where every decision makes sense when you understand the pattern behind it. And that's what makes this part of the journey so powerful, because it shows that major life changes rarely come from one moment. They come from accumulation, from repeated experiences that eventually lead to a turning point, a moment where continuing the same path no longer feels possible, and a new direction becomes necessary. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how all of these changes have reshaped the future of the Brown family, and what it means for where the story goes from here. Because when everything changes, the future becomes something entirely new. After the major decisions made by Christine Brown, Janelle Brown, and the gradual shift of Meri Brown, the Brown family seen on Sister Wives is no longer the same family viewers were introduced to years ago. And that realization is one of the biggest shocks for fans, because the original concept of the family was built on unity, a shared vision, multiple relationships functioning together as one connected structure. But now, that structure has changed, not suddenly, but completely. And when fans look at the situation today, it's clear that the future of the family doesn't look anything like its past. For Kody Brown, this shift represents a major transformation in his role. In the beginning, he was positioned as the center of a large interconnected family, a figure responsible for maintaining balance across multiple relationships. But as those relationships changed, and in some cases separated, his role naturally shifted as well, from leading a unified family to navigating a much smaller, more concentrated dynamic. And that change carries both practical and emotional implications, because it alters not just how he interacts with each relationship, but how he defines his place within the overall structure. For Robyn Brown, the future appears more stable compared to the others. Her relationship with Kody has remained the most consistent, and as a result, their dynamic now feels like the central focus of what remains of the original family structure. But even that stability exists within a very different context, because it's no longer part of a large balanced system. It's part of something that has been reshaped by change, and that changes how it's perceived. For Christine Brown, the future represents freedom, a complete shift away from the structure she once lived in. Her decision to leave opened the door to a new life, one defined by independence, personal choice, and a different kind of fulfillment. And for many fans, her journey has become one of the most inspiring parts of the entire story, because it shows what it looks like to step away from something that no longer works and create something new. For Janelle Brown, the future is more self-directed, less about fitting into a shared system and more about building her own path. Her independence has become a defining part of her journey, and that independence allows her to move forward without relying on the structure that once defined her life. With Meri Brown, the future is about transformation. Her journey has been less about a single decision and more about ongoing change, redefining her identity, exploring new opportunities, and stepping into a version of herself that exists beyond the limitations of the past. And when you look at all of these paths together, one thing becomes clear. The family is no longer moving in the same direction. Each person is following their own path, their own priorities, their own vision of what the future should look like. And while that may seem like a breakdown of the original idea, it can also be seen as an evolution, because sometimes growth means moving apart, not out of conflict, but out of change. For viewers of Sister Wives, this new reality creates a different kind of viewing experience. It's no longer about watching a single, unified family navigate life together. It's about watching multiple individuals navigate their own journeys, connected by history but not defined by the same structure. And that shift adds a new layer of complexity to the story, because it raises new questions. What does the future of the show look like? How will these individual paths continue to unfold? Will there be moments of reconnection, or will the distance continue to grow? And perhaps most importantly, what does this transformation say about the original idea of the family? Because when something changes this much, it invites reflection on what worked, what didn't, and what it all means moving forward. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how fans are interpreting this new future and why the conversation around the Brown family is more intense than ever. Because when a story changes this dramatically, people don't just watch, they react.
As the future of the Brown family continues to evolve, one thing has become impossible to ignore. The conversation around sister wives is louder than ever. And at the center of that conversation is Kody Brown. Because now that fans have recognized the pattern, they're not just watching passively. They're actively discussing it, breaking it down, debating what it all means. Across social media, forums, and comment sections, viewers are sharing their interpretations, pointing out specific moments, comparing past and present behavior, and trying to understand how everything unfolded the way it did. But what's interesting is that this conversation isn't one-sided. It's layered, complex, full of different perspectives. Some fans are highly critical. They see the pattern as clear evidence of imbalance. They point to repeated behaviors that, in their view, contributed to the breakdown of multiple relationships. For them, the story feels straightforward, a gradual shift that led to predictable outcomes. But others take a more nuanced approach. They acknowledge the pattern, but also consider the complexity of the situation, the challenges of maintaining multiple relationships, the pressures of living life on camera, the fact that not every detail is visible to the audience. And that perspective adds depth to the conversation, because it reminds people that what they're seeing is part of a bigger picture, not the entire story. Still, even with those differences in opinion, one thing remains consistent: engagement. Fans are more invested than ever, more curious, more analytical, because this isn't just about watching a reality show anymore. It's about understanding a long-term narrative that has unfolded over years. And when a story has that kind of history, people naturally want to make sense of it. Another reason the conversation has grown so intense is because of how relatable the underlying themes are. Even though the structure of the Brown family is unique, the emotions involved are not. Relationship struggles, communication breakdowns, feeling unheard or unbalanced. These are experiences many people can connect with in their own lives. And when viewers see those themes play out on Sister Wives, it creates a deeper level of engagement. Because it's not just about them. It reflects something familiar, something personal, something real. There's also the element of realization, the idea that something was always there, but only now being fully understood. And that kind of realization tends to spark strong reactions, because it changes how people interpret everything that came before. Scenes that once seemed neutral now feel significant. Moments that were overlooked now feel important. And that shift in perception keeps the conversation going. For Christine Brown, Janelle Brown, and Meri Brown, this ongoing discussion also influences how their decisions are viewed. What once felt surprising now feels understandable. What once seemed sudden now feels like the result of a long process. And that reinterpretation gives their stories a different kind of clarity. Even Robyn Brown's role in the conversation has become a focal point, not necessarily because of individual moments, but because of how her relationship contrasts with the others. And that contrast continues to fuel discussion, because differences invite questions, and questions keep the conversation alive. For Kody Brown, this level of public analysis means that every action is now viewed through a more critical lens. Every interaction, every decision, every response, all of it becomes part of the larger narrative fans are building. And once that level of attention is reached, it doesn't easily fade, because people are invested. They want answers. They want clarity. They want to understand the full story. For viewers of Sister Wives, this ongoing conversation has become part of the experience itself. Watching the show is just one part. Discussing it, analyzing it, interpreting it, that's the other half.
And together, those elements create something much bigger than a typical reality series. They create a shared narrative, one that continues to evolve with every new episode, every new moment, every new perspective. As we move into the final part, we'll bring everything together, looking at what this pattern ultimately reveals and why fans feel like they finally uncovered something important about Kody. Because in the end, it's not just about what happened, it's about what it means. After everything viewers have rewatched, analyzed, and discussed about Sister Wives, one thing has become clear. Fans don't feel like they've discovered a single shocking moment. They feel like they finally understood the full picture. Because the truth about Kody Brown isn't hidden in one episode or one decision. It's revealed through patterns, through consistency, through the way small moments connect over time. And now that fans see that pattern, everything feels different. What once seemed confusing now feels logical. What once felt sudden now feels built over time. And that's the real shift in perspective. It's not about finding something new. It's about seeing what was always there, with clarity. One of the biggest realizations fans are coming to is that actions matter more than intentions. Whether Kody's behavior was intentional or not, the outcome is what shaped the family. The repeated patterns in communication, the shifts in attention, the way relationships evolved or didn't. All of these factors created a direction, a path that the family followed over time. And that path led to major changes. For Christine Brown, it led to the decision to leave. For Janelle Brown, it led to independence. For Meri Brown, it led to self-discovery and transformation. And for Robyn Brown, it resulted in a relationship that now stands apart from the others. Each outcome is different, but they are all connected, because they all stem from the same evolving pattern. Another important understanding is that relationships don't usually break because of one big moment. They change because of repeated experiences, small things that build over time, conversations that don't fully resolve, needs that aren't consistently met, moments of distance that gradually become the norm. And when those experiences repeat often enough, they shape decisions. They create turning points. They define the future. For fans of Sister Wives, this realization has transformed the way they see the entire journey. It's no longer about isolated drama. It's about long-term development, a story that unfolded slowly but meaningfully. And that's why this feels so significant, because it gives context to everything. It connects the beginning to the present. It explains how a family that once seemed united became something entirely different. But perhaps the most powerful takeaway is this. People grow. Situations change. And not every structure can remain the same forever. What started as one vision for the Brown family evolved into something new. Not necessarily better or worse, but different. And that difference is the result of years of experiences, choices, and patterns. For Kody Brown, this means that his role in the story is now being viewed through a more complete lens. Not just based on individual moments, but on the overall direction of his actions over time. And for the wives, it means their decisions are being understood in a deeper way. Not as sudden changes, but as responses to long-term experiences. This is why fans feel like they've missed something before. Because when you're watching in real time, it's hard to see patterns forming. It's only when you step back, when you look at everything together, that the full picture comes into focus. And now, that picture feels clear. Not perfect, not simple, but understandable. In the end, this isn't just a story about one person or one family. It's a story about patterns, about how small moments add up, about how relationships evolve over time, and about how understanding those patterns can completely change the way we see everything. Because sometimes the biggest revelation isn't something new. It's finally seeing the truth that was there all along.